Right, so let's run this. And if you remember from the last video, I've got the player moving around, and if you have a look over here on the right, let's hide that for the moment because you'll see why that's important shortly. There's the speed. Oops. It goes up and down. And that speed is now modulated by an envelope, whereas before, the amount of time you spent walking increased the speed. Well, it still does that. But now what happens is that the actual speed of the character is not singular or a scalar. It is a scalar, but it varies over time. And it varies over time thanks to an envelope. So it takes time to get up to maximum speed. And then when you let go, it takes time to come back to a complete stop. Now, the idea of an envelope can be used in so many different ways in a video game. And of course, with my background in music, the idea of an envelope seems useful beyond its original context. Here is that envelope. We can ignore enabled and active. The attack is the attack time in seconds. In other words, how long it takes to build up to maximum value, which is 1. And the decay is how long it takes after it's reached the maximum value to come down to a sustained level, which is defined here. The sustained level is 0.9, which is obviously slightly less than 1. And the sustain here is how long it will stay in the sustained phase, which doesn't really matter that much in this situation because I've defined this to be a manual envelope, which means that the release portion, in other words, how long it takes for the value that this is modulating to decay to 0, here we've got it to 2/3 of a second, and that's triggered when you stop pressing down on your direction key. This is the interesting bit here. This amplitude here is the main output value of the envelope, and rather than it just being a public float, this points to a scriptable object, which is a float variable that can then be used to hook this envelope up to many different inputs or indeed outputs. Now I'll go into how the scriptable object works later because the implementation I've got here isn't ideal simply because I'm doubling up. I'll explain that in a future video. For now, you just need to know that this thing here points to this over here, which has an initial value of 0 but can be modulated, and this is the thing that's doing the modulating, the envelope that you saw earlier. So we still got pretty much the same functionality, except now we've created an envelope that will modulate the player speed, and we can use that for just about anything else that we want to modulate envelope style. Let's have a look at the code, shall we? That's the player. Let's have a quick look at this awful code. Here we've got the envelope here. It's defined up here, and on enable we register it for updates. It gets called from a game instance, and then when we disable it we unregister it like good citizens. When we start, what do we do? Where do we activate it? Okay, so we've registered it for updates, and it will get called by the game instance. And here at the top, you can see that the speed, which is public, and it goes into Unity's character controller, is modulated by the envelope's amplitude. Now remember, that's a float variable. It's one of these things, which I'll go into detail later. But there you go, there's a float value. And it's the scriptable scriptable object form that makes it so useful and flexible. So going back to the player, the speed was normally just lerped, and as you can see, there's an initial speed, a maximum speed, the time you spent using the speed, in other words, your practice level, divided by the time it takes to get to maximum speed. So the more time you spend at certain speed, the more skillful you get at speed. It's a very, very simple implementation. It won't be like this, obviously. But the key thing here is that the speed is then multiplied by the amplitude of the envelope, which, if you have a look, is not updated from here, because it's updated from the game instance, which goes through its entire list of iUpdate types, which is here. And that's really simple and straightforward. This interface lets you register something, unregister something, and then update it. And that is done in the game. So in update, you can see that I'm going through my list of updaters and updating accordingly. It's very simple here. All I'm doing is allowing you to add to the list and remove from the list, and that is done through the registration. So very simple. Going to the envelope is a really simple type that adheres to the iModifier and iUpdate interfaces. A modifier will be an envelope. So let's have a look at modifier. Very simple. Is it active? Is it enabled? Activate it, deactivate it. And it's important to activate and deactivate, and we're going to have a look at that now. When does it get activated in the player? Well, when you know there's going to be some movement. So here, animator set upon key presses. Don't worry, this is really awful code. It will get better. I have put a whole bunch of stuff into the player class. It will all come out and become nice and neat and abstracted. But anyway, if it wasn't moving before, we will activate the envelope, and that starts the process of envelope updating, and we are then able to extract values dynamically. Remember, we don't do the update of the envelope here. It's done from the game updater for all iUpdate interface types. And when we stop moving, we deactivate the envelope. Now, this doesn't stop values from coming out of it. All it does is it triggers the release phase, which is why even though there are no keystrokes coming in, when you stop, it will continue to receive values until it's 0. This also means that this move direction here, although it's pointing in the right direction, well, by the time the envelope outputs 0, the speed will be 0 because we'll be multiplying an amplitude of 0. So that will all work. I've decided not to use an envelope for the turn speed right now. I'm just making sure everything works nicely. So going back to this, you can see that works quite nicely. It takes time to speed up. We'll show it. And it takes time to slow down. I've been moving quite a bit now, so I've got a bit more speed. And that builds up. And you've seen the rest. That's it. So envelope functionality in. I'll be able to use that for a whole bunch of things. And that's it for now. See you in the next one.